everyone. Welcome to our third week of social justice. I hope everyone is doing well and things like that. So for this week, we're going to start diving into our next unit. So we've talked a little bit kind of about beliefs and values and things like that. And we're moving into our unit on LGBTQ. Now, this is a really interesting unit. And this is a unit obviously very near and dear to my heart because I'm part of this community. I did a lovely little drawing of myself. And this is really hard to do online, just because it's hard to have that connection, to have conversations about topics that challenge a lot of beliefs. Some of them in society, some of them our own beliefs. So this is really hard to do, and I'm hoping that on our Thursday, for my office hours, if anyone wants to come in and just chat about anything about this unit, but obviously to keep in mind to be open, respectful, all those lovely things that you guys already do. So here are just a couple facts and figures. This is from 2011, so it's 9 years old, but it really kind of just sort of shows why do we talk about this unit in social justice? And there's a lot of statistics on this slide. The first one is the one that really kind of is the most interesting. So it talks about how in this study there was about 3,700 students who participated in this survey on homophobia. And they noted from the survey that about 70% of all participants, those who are part of the LGBTQ community and those who weren't, reported hearing lots of interesting derogatory phrases such as "that's so gay" in school. And probably most of you know that because you hear it in the hallways and things like that. And I've definitely had to call out some students for using that sort of language because it has very negative connotations, and I feel like that's like the biggest issue. I feel that everything else, the acceptance, especially by younger people, tends to be a lot more open. There's a lot more discussion, but I feel like we're still working on the language component. So to get into talking about, well, what is the LGBTQ plus? So just going through kind of what the acronym actually means: so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning, and the plus is everything else. So anything that doesn't fall into the regular kind of heterosexual, straight relationships between biological male and a biological female. Pretty much everything else kind of out of that sort of group falls into kind of the category of LGBTQ. And we're going to be looking at kind of some of the definitions a little bit later on that are kind of part of that. So in the Canadian Human Rights Act, which was created in 1985, this is essentially rights that Canadians have. And one of them is that people should have equal opportunity for the lives that they want to live without being hindered or discriminated based on, and the ones obviously we focus on, sexual orientation and marital status. Both of which, especially for people of the LGBTQ, there's been tons of discrimination for job opportunities and things like that, or even being discriminated in the workplace because of one's sexual orientation. But the Human Rights Act says that that's not allowed, and there have been cases for that. So there's kind of two very interesting sort of terms. The term coming out versus outing someone. Now, obviously, the phrasing of these changes throughout time, but kind of the basics is coming out. So when someone of the LGBTQ community discloses their sexual orientation or gender identity. So for instance, through this video, if you're hearing me say, yes, my name is Miss Dewick and I am bisexual, that means I am attracted to males, females, and everything in between. I happen to be dating a dude, so that would essentially be me coming out. Outing someone, this is when another person, so say for instance, one of my friends outed me, so disclosed my sexual orientation without my consent. That's outing someone. And oftentimes, especially in friend groups, it's not necessarily intentional for someone to out someone else. I mean, there definitely are malicious intents certain times, but oftentimes someone will say something and someone else will be like, oh, I didn't know that, and then they realize, oh shoot, maybe I shouldn't have said that. So oftentimes for people, especially part of this community, it's always really important to kind of just check in to see if that's okay. I mean, if they're completely out, like everybody knows that, well, say for instance, me. Everyone knows that Miss Duick is just lavishing bisexual. I say it all the time. To kind of normalize being part of that community and things like that. So pretty much anyone can just be like, oh yeah, Miss Duick, yeah, she's bi. And that's not outing me because I'm already out. So this is a lovely drawing that actually came out of the organization pronounced Metrosexual, and they came up with this little person. This is a genderbread person. Probably some of you have seen this in my classroom. And essentially what it is it's kind of a very simple breakdown to showcase the different components of what makes us us. So things such as gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, sexual attraction, and romantic attraction. So we're going to kind of go through that. So gender identity is the psychological sense of self. So who you are in your head, what you know about yourself based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand about the roles of gender. So this falls into personality traits, jobs, hobbies, likes, dislikes, roles, expectation. So this is how you inside your head feel about who you are, how womanly or manly or somewhere in the middle, or you feel that you don't identify to either of those genders. So that's in your kind of for you, your sense of self. Then we have gender expressions, the ways that someone presents their gender. This is through actions, clothing, demeanor, the outward facing self interpreted by others based on the gender norms of that society. So that could be in the way that people dress. Say, for instance, for me, I love wearing pretty dresses and things like that, but which is a very feminine sort of trait. But my hair is also really short. I mean, it's growing out now because I haven't seen a hairdresser in a while. So short hair is a much more masculine thing. So I'm kind of expressing two separate sort of gender expressions. And a lot of people, we kind of are starting to move towards more kind of gender neutral sort of dressing, how makeup, even though it's considered a more feminine thing, I feel should be more gender neutral. I think everyone has a right to look their best and however they see their best. But yeah, gender expression is more how do others perceive the way you're expressing yourself. Now, this is a really interesting one. So biological sex is to do with the bits. So the genitals, chromosomes, hormones, body hair. This can sometimes be referred to as anatomical sex or physical sex. And there's kind of a spectrum of sort of three sort of major categories and everything in between. So there's obviously male, which is usually XY, female, which is XX, and then a really interesting one, which is intersex. Now this one, for intersex, this is somewhere in the middle where the biological sex, so the genitals, the chromosomes, or the hormones, don't necessarily align into the box of either male or female. There's this beautiful documentary, which I wish I had access to show you guys, and it's talking about people who are intersex, that they fall kind of somewhere in kind of the middle, something entirely different. And I was actually surprised how many people actually are intersex. Some people know that, and some people don't. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'll see if I can find some YouTube videos on it. So sexual attraction, this is, in simplest terms, this is who you want to sleep with. So the emotional response people feel when they find someone sexually appealing, the desire for sexual contact with that person. It's also important to note that there does not need to be any sexual attraction either, and that's referred to as asexual. So someone who doesn't, and it's important to note that this is different than someone who is celibate. So someone who is celibate is choosing, or celibacy, is choosing to abstain from sex. They still have maybe sexual urges, but they choose not to sleep with anyone. Oftentimes we see in shows and stuff like that, it's usually things like monks in some temple in the middle of nowhere tend to be celibate or choose celibacy or abstaining from sex. This is not the same as someone who is asexual. Someone who is asexual has no sexual desire to sleep with anyone. And it's, yeah, so if you kind of look for underneath the sexual attraction, you have to women, females, femininity, men, males, masculinity, somewhere in the middle, or none at all. Then we have romantic attraction, and I like to make the distinction between romantic attraction and sexual attraction. Sexual attraction is who you want to sleep with. Romantic attraction oftentimes is the desire to have a relationship with someone that is not just based on sex. It's also important to note that romantic attraction and sexual attraction can go hand in hand. They can be separate and different and things like that. There also does not necessarily need to even be romantic attraction. There are people who are not romantically attracted to anyone. So obviously you have the same sort of thing, romantically attracted to women, females, femininity, men, males, masculinity, anywhere in that spectrum or not at all. So another part of the LGBTQ is pronouns. So the way in which a person is identified. So there's kind of sort of three sort of major sort of categories oftentimes when people are using pronouns to identify themselves. There's he, him, she, her, and they, them. And why is this important? Because oftentimes these pronouns in our society oftentimes dictate how one interacts with someone else when using those pronouns. Oftentimes people who intentionally misgender someone or use the wrong pronouns intentionally, their purpose for that is to call that person out in a way that is hurtful and harmful, whether that person be gender fluid or transgender. So oftentimes, usually if I was actually in the class, we'd actually have a little exercise just to kind of normalize asking for someone's pronouns. Is going around the room and asking each person, so they say their name, what would you like to be referred to as, and what are your pronouns. So for me, I'm referred to as Miss Dewick, and my pronouns are she, her. So let's get into some of the terms. There was a note sheet that went with this that had all these terms on it, but I'm just going to explain them to you. Okay, so there's questioning. So the process in exploring one's gender identity, sexual orientation, as well as choosing not to identify with any of the labels at that time. Oftentimes, lots of people go through that questioning phase, especially, like pretty much I think everyone at some point goes through a phase where it's just trying to figure out kind of who you are. Not even necessarily to do with gender identity or sexual orientation, but just figuring out kind of who are you? How do you want to express yourself? What sort of friends do you want? And things like that. For me, definitely the questioning period, I was probably 13 or 14, not entirely sure how I really wanted to be dressing. Some days I dressed really masculine, some days really feminine, and lots of my friends were commenting on it, and I didn't know quite how to articulate how I was feeling, or even who kind of like I was attracted to. Like I remember watching movies as a kid, and there'd be this beautiful female character on screen, and I'd be like, oh, she's so pretty. And I didn't quite understand what it meant to be bi back then, because a lot of my friends were really, really conservative. So coming into terms with that, I was kind of in that period of questioning, kind of wondering, okay, am I actually just straight, or what's going on? So the next one, bisexual. So this is the one that I could talk of forever as a bisexual woman. So individuals who are attracted to and may form sexual or romantic relationships with women and men. These people may feel equally attracted to each gender, may experience stronger attractions to one gender than the other. This ratio of attraction may vary over time. Absolutely. It's also important to note that there are many bisexuals who will be in a monogamous relationship, meaning with one person, either of the opposite gender or the same gender, and oftentimes people like to make assumptions based on who they're dating at that time. even though in bisexuality, pretty much, if we take me, for instance, I might be currently in a relationship with Mr. Turner, but that doesn't mean that I'm choosing him because he's a man. I'm choosing him because he is my partner and because I like him, regardless of whatever gender or sexual orientation he is. Him and I like each other. So with non-binary, this is a spectrum of gender identities that don't really fall into the masculine or feminine. Oftentimes, they are outside that gender binary of kind of one or the other. Oftentimes, people in this category, and I'm not saying for all because I cannot make those sort of sweeping statements, but often people who are non-binary usually use the they, them pronouns. Then we have transgender or trans. This is an umbrella term used to describe the wide range of people whose gender identity or expression differ from their assigned sex, or societal and cultural expectations of their assigned sex. So gender binary is kind of the term and the view that there are only two genders, male and female, and that they're separate, unchanging, that there's kind of the whole, oh, boys wear blue, girls wear pink. That tends to be that kind of mindset. And it's really hard, especially if one grew up with the gender binary mindset, that it's hard to change. And oftentimes when they come across people who don't necessarily fit into that, there tends to be this kind of reality shift. Either that person changes their viewpoint or they get very stuck in their ways and feel that the other person is attacking their viewpoint because it's not what they're used to. We also have the term two-spirit. Now, this term is used within some Indigenous communities. Now, this is not a term that anyone who isn't part of those Indigenous communities can use. Oftentimes, this encompasses sexual, gender, cultural, and spiritual identities. Oftentimes, a person who is two-spirited, I'll make sure I'm explaining this properly, is oftentimes the belief that that person was born with two spirits, with both the male and female spirit. And oftentimes these were revered as spiritual guidance counselors. There's a very fantastic video that I'll have to link you guys at one point. There's a two-spirited doctor who is living up north. I believe it's in Alberta or Saskatchewan. And their whole thing that they talk about is the fact that they're able to support kind of both sort of sides and aspects of the people in their community. It's really, really cool. I'll have to see if I can link you guys to that. So obviously we have the very simple terms. So oftentimes when someone refers to themselves as gay, it's a person who's attracted to someone of the same gender. This is oftentimes referred to or is used by men. That's not always the case. I've had a lot of female friends, instead of using the term lesbian, they might use the term gay. But it's kind of the just sort of blanket term to represent somebody who doesn't necessarily fall into the stereotypical boy who likes girl. Now, the term queer is really interesting. So it's often used to refer to a range of non-heterosexual, non-cisgender people, conveniently shorthanded to just basically LGBT. Now, it's important to note that the term queer used to be used in hate speech as a slur towards people of the LGBTQ community. This term queer originally actually just meant strange. And for a little bit, it was definitely used for, oh, those strange people over there. This is obviously a term, people who aren't part of the LGBTQ, I always kind of caution them for using this term because it carries kind of some baggage with it. But I definitely have referred to in front of students myself as queer. And for some of them, if they don't know that I'm bi, they look a little confused and I have to explain to them that sometimes I like to use the term to kind of reclaim it as a member of the LGBTQ community. So then there's the term cisgender, which is the opposite of transgender. Now, cisgender is where one's gender identity matches one's assigned sex. So I would be considered cisgender. The bits that I was born with, which are female, I have female chromosomes, so I'm XX. That's how I identify the pronouns I use and the way that I kind of sort of display myself to society. Then obviously you have lesbian, oftentimes a term used specifically for women who are primarily romantically and sexually attracted to women. Now, we talked a little bit about the term intersex, so this is a reproductive or sexual anatomy that does not closely resemble typical male or female reproductive or sexual anatomy. So it might be related to genitalia, secondary sex characteristics, chromosomal makeup. It's a really interesting sort of thing because oftentimes what ends up happening, kind of back in the day, is if someone was born intersex and it was very obvious that they were intersex, the doctors would make decisions with the parents without telling the child. They'd basically do a surgery. So if there was a really, really small penis or a penis and a vagina present, the doctor would kind of make the decisions and they would tell the parents, and then the parents wouldn't tell their kid. And it led to some issues you can probably assume much later, where people couldn't understand why they felt so uncomfortable in their own bodies, or they had medical complications later on, and then found out that they were intersex. And I can't even begin to imagine what that would feel like. So yeah, that's kind of one of the ones when we think of terms, especially in terms of biological sex, intersex is definitely part of that. Then we have gender fluid. So oftentimes this kind of goes with kind of non-binary, whereas, however, this person, their gender identity and presentation is a spectrum. They don't really confine themselves to one gender or even a few. Instead, they might fluctuate between presenting feminine, masculine, neither, both. Yeah. So asexual, we already talked about this one. So a person who generally does not feel sexual attraction or desire to any group of people. Again, reminder, this is not celibacy. It's not refraining or restraining oneself from being sexually active. This is somebody who actually does not feel sexual attraction. Okay, so for the timeline assignment, which is your assignment for this week, you're going to be looking at specifically Canada, just because I kind of want it to remain kind of in our country, and I'll show you kind of some of the examples and requirements for this assignment. So what you are going to do is you're going to find 10 historical events for the LGBTQ community and create a very simple timeline that illustrates these advances. Now, it's important to note, because one of the questions that always comes up is, do they have to be positive things? I will say for this assignment, not necessarily. I mean, it is nice to see the advances because, man, we need some happiness in our lives, but they can be any sort of things. Maybe there were riots as a result of maybe some legislation that was passed and things like that. You can choose to put those in. I will allow it. I do want you to kind of sort of look at, as I said, historical facts from Canada, just to kind of keep it within within our country. There's a link on the actual assignment that will take you to a beautiful website on Wikipedia that has pretty much the entire kind of timeline of Canadian history. So this assignment can obviously be done. It's a very simple timeline. It could be on lined paper, PowerPoint, whatever you want. So all you need is essentially the title of the event and the date. Then for each of the assignments, you're going to do a very, very short description of the event, 50 to 100 words. That's it. So think of these sort of things. What was the implication of this event? So what was happening? How did it impact the LGBTQ community? Those are kind of the two things just to think about. Or you could just give a brief summary of what was going on at that time and things like that. Maybe it was a major court case that ruled in favor because of certain things. Maybe there was a protest, or maybe the first gay pride parade and how many people attended. Those are some things to think about. So obviously, so this is just a picture of what the page looks like. You basically just, even if you just put into Google timeline of LGBT history in Canada, you pretty much got everything from the start of the 1600s all the way until present date. It obviously doesn't have everything, and you just need to pick 10 items. Pretty much anything goes. Whatever kind of really sticks out to you is, oh, that's interesting, you can put on your timeline. Now here's an example, a very, very simplified example of a timeline. It doesn't have the information, those 50 to 100 words, but I just wanted to show you that this could be one way. Maybe on like a Word document. So here's my dates, here's the title for each of them, and then I'd have to give 50 to 100 word explanation about each of these items. Or if you want to be a little more artsy fartsy, here's some other timelines that are a little more artistic. This is not a requirement. You do not need to make it sort of artsy fartsy, but it's kind of a cool thing to take a look at. And I'm hoping maybe on the Thursday that we'll kind of share out some of the answers that you guys came up with for your timeline.